My lords, ladies and gentlemen, it's my very great pleasure to wish you all a happy and prosperous new year, and above all to welcome you here this evening to the Academy's New Year reception and lecture. And as we start another year, I'd like on behalf of the whole Academy's Council to thank you for not only coming to this event, but also for your support for the Academy's activities that you have provided over the last 12 months. 2013 was quite a year for the Academy, with the Global Grand Challenges Summit in March and the announcement and awarding of the first Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering in June. 2013 was also a year in which we made great progress in our support for national policy, with the Academy undertaking important work to support the national effort through education and engineering policy. And we also continued our involvement in our promotion of a modern industrial strategy, which I'm glad to report BIS are taking forward in a positive way. Our Engineering for Growth campaign and our role in the Tomorrow Engineers programme for young people helped enhance the public perception of engineering. But there is much to do in 2014. It will be another busy year for the Academy, and I hope that you will all participate in many of our activities as possible to ensure that we build on the success of last year. And a critical task remains to inspire many more young people to take up a career in engineering. And it is only with the support, leadership and encouragement of our fellows that we can achieve important goals and build the strength of this National Academy. The tradition of our New Year reception brings together fellows and their partners and special guests to meet socially and at the same time to hear an expert speak on a subject of broad interest. And tonight I have the honour of introducing Lord Finkelstein, Daniel Finkelstein, the Associate Editor for The Times. Lord Finkelstein has close family relationships with this Academy. His father was the late Emeritus Professor Ludwig Finkelstein, who was elected to the fellowship in 1985 and became Dean of the School of Engineering at City University. Lord Finkelstein's brother is also a Fellow of the Academy, Professor Anthony Finkelstein. Anthony's going to stand up so that you can all recognise him as well.
Just one more humiliation.
Now, Anthony is Dean of the Faculty of Engineering Sciences and also Professor of Software System Engineering at UCL. And I'm very delighted to welcome him tonight and to introduce him to you all as well. But Daniel Finkelstein began his career as a journalist and technology writer. And before joining the Times 12 years ago, he worked as a policy advisor to the Prime Minister, John Major, and then to the leader of the Opposition, William Hague. He is currently chairman of Policy Exchange, the conservative think tank, and he was made a life peer and joined the House of Lords in 2013. Lord Finkelstein is this evening going to give us a talk entitled The Used Car Test, which promises to provide us with a look inside the mind of the politician and insight into political processes. So it now gives me great pleasure to invite you, Lord Finkelstein, to give your talk, after which you've kindly agreed to take questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I've just realised I've turned on the computer. How do I turn it off? Maybe I'll just do this. Will that turn it off?
You'd like it all?
It doesn't matter that much. It's absolutely fine. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak here tonight. It's wonderful to be able to come after what is just a few feet from the House of Lords. I was once invited to give a speech where I had to go all the way to Norwich, and when I got there were only two people in the audience. One of them was the person that had invited me. The other was somebody who waited till I finished speaking. Then I asked him whether he'd like to join the cause that I was supporting. He said he would, but it would interfere with the terms of his parole. This genuinely happened. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you this evening. Also because it gives me the opportunity to give to you my affection and admiration to this wonderful organisation, which has been a very important part of my family's life. Several of you are wearing ties which I might have mistaken as my father's, except for the fact that they were not covered in soup. But he had a great pride in his fellowship here, as I know Anthony does, and I'm delighted, partly at least in his memory, to be able to stand before you this evening, and I'm very grateful to you for inviting me. Richard Nixon was the subject of an advertising campaign by the Kennedys. Would you buy a used car from this man? And I have always thought that it wasn't a bad test of a politician as to whether you would buy a used car from them. And it set me to begin thinking, what were the rules of political activity, and not necessarily ones drawn from the world of politics itself. Could one draw from outside the world of politics some lessons that help explain how politicians behave and help guide politicians as to how they might consider behaving? And I want to give you some of those, which you'll accept come from me as a political journalist, and I know that some people regard political journalists as mere entertainers, exempting, of course, The Guardian from that restriction. But I hope I've gained working in politics and from my background as a systems analyst and technology journalist, and also from my work at the Times, some insights that you will find helpful. And I'm going to start with my football rule. Because on Saturdays in the Times during the football season, I write a column punningly called The Think Tank, and it is a statistical review of football. You might, if you ever watch a game, see John Motson, the commentator, give a lot of statistics about things that never happen. That is the first time that Everton have scored a goal away from home on Christmas Day against Manchester United, ignoring the fact that they never play Manchester United on Christmas Day, and therefore it was likely to be the first time it had happened. I'm interested much more in things that actually happen all the time, regularities rather than exceptions. And I've learnt a lot about how societies and politics works from following football. One of the advantages of the statistical model we have is its simplicity, and the fact that it realises that only a very few things, a few big things, are actually correlated to outcomes. And we notice that the more expert people are, the more likely they are to throw into their analysis things that have no correlation whatsoever to the outcome. Because no one wants to be the idiot who learns something that in fact has no bearing on what happens. So the more that you know, the more inclined you are to say something like this. The worst time to concede a goal is just before half-time. If I divided this audience into those people who knew something about football and those people who knew nothing about football, those people who knew something about football would nod sagely at the notion that conceding a goal just before half-time was a very bad thing. The rest of you would be clueless as to why that should be the case, and the rest of you would be correct. There's no statistical reason, or indeed psychological reason, or any other reason why it would be the worst time to concede a goal. Although Ian Wright, the striker for Arsenal, once said it was the worst time to concede a goal because George Graham, the Arsenal manager, would shout at him, which wasn't really quite what I meant. But it's because you are watching football all the time that you don't realise that it's just a bad idea to concede a goal, and there's no reason to think that it's the worst time to do it just before half-time. Indeed, studies in the United States suggest that the less people know about football, the more likely they were to be able to predict the outcome of the World Cup. they would then realise, for example, that a big country with a large GDP and footballing tradition was more likely to win than Malta, to win the World Cup. Whereas other people would begin to try to work out who the players were and whether Theo Walcott had been injured, and try to develop a theory which massively overestimated the impact that each of these individual variables had on the outcome. So one of the things that it gives you, this piece of work that we do on football, is a suspicion about anything other than the very big variables, which tend to be money and the number of points you've already scored in a season and whether or not you're at home, the last one of those being a bit of a mystery, but nevertheless, those things that affect the results, and not to trust people who are trying to make everything too complicated. The other thing that it's taught me is that there's no such thing as form. There is almost all the discussion in football concerns itself with whether a team is up or down, and it doesn't seem as though anybody who comments or plays or owns a football club has ever heard of the concept of randomness. They don't appear to understand that if a team is going to win 50% of its matches, it's unlikely to win, lose, win, lose, win, lose, but will do it in clusters. And all the studies of almost all sports suggest that these clusters are randomly distributed. Therefore, managers frequently get sacked for what is little more than regression to the mean. There is actually a competition called the Barclays Manager of the Month that is given to you for winning a cluster of games in a calendar month. Not actually a great achievement, it just means that randomly the cluster of games you won coincided with a calendar month. And people then actually get sacked when they then lose the games in the following calendar month. This actually did happen to Brian McDermott, the manager of Reading, who won Manager of the Month in one month and lost it the next. Lost his job the next. People do not understand the concept of randomness in football. And the problem is they don't really understand it in politics too. So most coverage of politics consists of taking experts, looking at events that are not correlated to outcomes, and drawing patterns in events that are in fact random. One of the most important things to understand when you are following politics is that nobody else is. That people have very little knowledge of who politicians are. This was brought home very, very strongly to me once during a previous football tournament, the European Championship. I went with a friend of mine to get a burger, and on the television was the football, and my friend pointed out that I wrote the football column. This woman was absolutely thrilled that she had a football columnist in her restaurant, asked me loads of questions, was delighted I worked for the Times, and totally failed to recognise that my friend was Chancellor of the Exchequer. The truth is that only 50% of people can actually recognise a picture of George Osborne, and most people don't know terribly much about the things that fill newspapers, prime ministers' questions, minor scandals. People are not watching and they don't follow. If you look at a focus group that, for example, the Conservative Party conducted some focus groups 4 or 5 years ago, do you know any Conservative apart from David Cameron? Somebody would say, this has really happened, somebody said Ed Miliband, and then somebody else said, oh, and his brother Ed Balls. Though my personal favourite is that somebody said, one group was asked, do you know any Jews in public life? When Michael Howard became leader of the Conservative Party, there was total silence in a group in Nottingham, and someone said Whoopi Goldberg. Which I thought was quite good. These details people are not following, and that's also true of a lot of statistics. So, for instance, it was the Liberal Democrat policy to put a penny on tax to pay for education. And when I worked for the Conservative Party, it occurred to us to wonder why it was this tax rise was popular when most of the time tax rises are unpopular. So we thought we'd do a little bit of research, and we discovered, no, indeed, people did want to put a penny on the tax to pay for education. Only not a penny in the pound. Just a penny. They didn't realise that that's what actually it meant. So the Liberal Democrat policy was popular, but about £11.80 less than people were willing to pay in tax in a week. So the truth is that people look at politics through expert eyes and write about politics through expert eyes when that's not how people are watching politics. The danger of what I've just said, and it's particularly, I know, because having grown up around engineering audiences, met many engineers, I know that instantly the thought will occur to you that that's typical of politics, and perhaps that cynicism about politics is merited. But actually, it isn't. What I've said means is that what really influences people is what actually happens to them in their real life. The things that people actually do, that's what influences them. The things that happen to them, not theories or ideas or vague abstractions. One of the reasons why the debate, and there are other reasons for this too, but one of the reasons why the debate on HS2 is as it is because sometimes people are actually experiencing real things that will happen to them. They're not engaged in an abstract argument. And abstract arguments pass people by a lot of the time. They don't engage in them. The reason they don't know the things that I talked about is that it's not very much use to them to know them. So it's a perfectly rational, it is, if you like, it's a heuristic. They don't know these things because it doesn't help them make decisions or live their lives. But that doesn't mean to say they don't have an instinct or that democracy doesn't work. It just means that people know the things that affect them and make decisions based on it. So if you like, it's the opposite of a sort of cynical and depressing thing. It means that a lot of the silly things that you see politicians engage in and the pointless rows don't affect the outcome. That's actually a good thing. You might ask the politicians why they still engage in that behaviour, and that's for you to ask and for me to wonder. And I do put that point to them quite a lot. But nevertheless, they go on. It's very difficult, I suppose, for people who are engaged in it to appreciate that quite a lot of that engagement is making no difference at all to the electorate. And what I always give as a piece of consistent political advice whenever I'm called on to make it is do the things that actually improve people's lives, and you'll be rewarded for those because they won't notice anything else. So that is my first rule, the football rule. The second rule is the peak end rule. If the electorate sort of decides based on its experience, what also matters is when they have that experience. The theory of pain was that the way that people would remember pain would be the length of time they experienced it multiplied by the amount of pain that they had. But various studies using colonoscopies discovered that that's not how people remembered pain. I wrote a column on this actually, and one or two people said to me it was a real mistake using colonoscopies because people stopped after the first paragraph particularly meant. But nevertheless, the theory they discovered is that what people experience is the peak of the pain and the end. And that's how they remember it. In other words, it was possible to make people remember an operation as less painful if you carried it on longer, thus the total amount of pain was greater, but you softened it towards the end. And that is how almost all statistical models of politics reveal that politics works. There's a very famous exchange between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter in which Ronald Reagan said to Jimmy, said in the debates, he said, are you, to the American people, better off than you were 4 years ago? And this is regarded by politicians as, the ultimate test. But the fascinating thing was, the answer to that question was yes. Yes, the American people were better off after 4 years of Jimmy Carter. The problem is they weren't better off in the last year of Jimmy Carter, only better off on average over the 4 years. And they couldn't remember how well off they were 4 years ago. If you were listening to, to any of what I said in the first part, you'll realise that asking someone how they're going to vote in a year's time is a pointless question because people don't think about it. And asking them how well off they were 3 years ago is a question they don't know either. It came to as a bit of a surprise, I only learnt this in my 30s, that I was one of the very few people who divides history into periods of government. Other people don't do that. And I thought everyone, sort of divided, whether something happened between February and October 1974 had special significance. But it turns out no. That's because that's not how people think. So they don't know how well off they were 4 years ago, or who was in government 3 years ago. What they appreciate is how well off they are now, how well off their family is now, and how well off they expect to be. And so what will impact the election is not just the realities of their life, but the realities of their life during a certain period, and that period will be in the 9 months before the general election and 3 months after it. The reason I picked that period is because in America, much more than in Britain, there's been a lot of modelling of election outcomes using different variables to discover what affects the outcome, and the economic growth and people's personal income is highly related to the election outcome. It's very, very predictive of what's going to happen. A few economic variables, but only in the last 9 months and first 3 months of the year. Now, obviously, what I'm telling you is that politicians can afford to do a lot more detailed controversial things. They can get away with a lot more of those things, providing they produce good outcomes. They can also do them, providing they don't produce providing they produce good outcomes at the right time. Because a lot of the rest of the time, people don't notice. And again, I think, although this timing thing's a bit more ambiguous in terms of its moral implications, the overall implication, which is that politicians, broadly speaking, are rewarded for their fitness to govern as against the other political parties, is a sort of encouraging message. So, thirdly, a very important political concept, loss aversion. If you ask someone to buy a concert ticket and try to get the highest price that you can, and people have done experiments, and you then subsequently try to buy the tickets back from them, you will find the price at which they're willing to sell you the tickets back vastly higher than the highest price they were willing to pay for the tickets in the first place. Economists, who have taken quite a long time to cotton on to people's personal behaviour and psychology, can't understand why this should be so. This is because of the endowment effect. When you have something, it's more valuable to you than it was before. If I gave you all a meaningless mug, which you had no particular value for, and then sought to get it back from you, you'd be quite irritated when I asked for it back. Even though you didn't have it before, you didn't expect to have it, you didn't want it, actually, and in theory you don't want it, but if you had it, it would be annoying that I took your mug from you. And a lot of politics works like that. Indeed, Danny Alexander's wife works for Psychologist magazine, and she once said to me, what single piece of psychological advice do you think you'd give Danny as Chief Secretary of the Treasury? And I said, people are loss averse. That is to say, they will react completely differently to you taking away £50 that they have been receiving, to you cancelling a £50 they haven't yet had. And the political reaction to those things are completely different. It also explains a huge amount about one of the most frequent rows I couldn't understand for a long time in politics. When the Conservative Party was in office in the 1980s and the Labour Party put forward plans for public spending, the Conservative Party was successful in arguing that their increase would increase taxes, and people didn't want increased taxes, so they decided to stick with the Conservatives because they didn't want the increase in tax. Then, after a while, various things fell apart, Labour got elected, and exactly the opposite argument was made. The Labour Party said, if you elect the Conservative Party, they're going to cut spending. And people thought they don't want to cut spending, so we're not going to elect the Conservatives. In other words, they voted for two entirely different positions. Now, there was a temporal explanation. These were at different times, and that is one possible explanation, I grant. But I think the real explanation is loss aversion. Basically, they were in favour of keeping whatever it was they had and against being something new, untested, that was being given to them as an alternative. And if you offer somebody £1 of tax cuts in return for £1 of spending cuts when they have the spending, they won't do the deal because they regard the pound that they have as more valuable than the pound that you're offering them. And if you offer them £1 of tax increases in return for £1 of extra spending, they won't do that deal either because they don't want to put their taxes up. And this is because they're loss averse. So what opposition parties then try and do is offer people £2 of tax cuts for every pound of spending, which either increases borrowing or is totally incredible, but is designed to try to equalise the deal between what you have and what they're offering you, because otherwise you won't take the deal. And this is the reason why governments always have a big advantage, because they sit on the baseline and they police loss aversion. What George Osborne was trying to do on Monday, when he announced how much money the government was going to have to cut in future, was to create a baseline that meant that every time the Labour Party proposed something, it was a departure from that. In other words, a situation that you had already and you were losing something from it. Taxes were going to go up and it was going to be worse, therefore, because he knows that people are loss averse. This is very important in trying to win or take part in any argument. You have to HS2, for example, has to be vastly more valuable than the it's not enough for it to be a tiny bit more valuable. Obviously, an economist would say if it was £1 more valuable than what you were losing, it was worth having. In fact, we're having an argument about whether 4 times more or 5 times more is ever enough for an engineering project. This is because of loss aversion, and it's one of the most important psychological, political rules. The contrast principle. Well, I don't need to tell this audience, but I suppose to explain what I'm saying, I better. If you put one hand in a bucket of cold water and one hand in a bucket of hot water, take both and put them in a bucket of lukewarm water, the hand that was in the cold water will be hot and the hand that was in the hot water will be cold. Contrast principle. This is very critical in politics. I'll give you a very good example that was provided by a social psychologist, Robert Cialdini. He said, it was a letter from a woman from university. Dear Mum and Dad, please sit down. I want to tell you what happened when the fire destroyed all of my belongings. The concussion is now wearing off as I jumped out of the first floor window. Fortunately, I met a man from the petrol station across the road who rushed me to hospital. He's a lovely man and a very good petrol attendant, and we've fallen in love. Although he's been married 6 times already, we intend to be married and hope to be married before the pregnancy shows. And then said, actually, Mum, I'm not pregnant. I haven't met a man from the petrol station. He wasn't married 6 times already. The fire did not destroy all my belongings. Haven't got concussion. But I did fail my first year exam and I want to do it again into perspective. This is politics in a nutshell, what I've just told you. So you asked Tony Blair a question. I'm not old Labour. I'm not the old Conservatives. Thus I am new Labour. Most politicians create things out of the things that they are not through political contrasts. And you can see that happening all over. From the structure that I've outlined, it's extremely difficult to work out the result of the general election. Because although the points that I've made would suggest to you, well, the economy is going to come right. At the same time, people don't feel personally better off. Then there's the loss aversion point. When the government's been cutting things, people feel cross about that. They don't like losing things. Even though the government's got control of the baseline, even that baseline presents them with further difficult decisions. But on the other hand, there's the contrast principle that can be explained in politics in 2 technical words, which are Ed and Miliband. Whatever, by the way, is not a political point on my behalf, because I've known him for a long time, and it's somebody I've got a lot of respect and admiration for, and I think has got a lot of good things to be said for him, both as a decisive politician and as a very nice person too, actually, in many ways. But he has, I just added the in many ways for no reason at all, but just a very nice person is what I meant to say. But that isn't the view of voters when you poll, particularly not in focus groups. And they don't think of him as being a prime minister that they want or regard him as a realistic alternative to the current Prime Minister. There's an element of loss aversion there. David Cameron is the Prime Minister, so he'd be losing his whatever his characteristics are, and the challenger always has more of a difficult time. But I think that is an element that makes the next general election extremely difficult to work out, because you're not simply voting for the government, you also have to vote for an opposition. I have two more political rules. The first is the university fraternity test. So if you are a member of an American university and are invited to join a fraternity, it turns out that the more humiliating the fraternity ritual, the more likely you are to value membership of the fraternity. You've possibly worked out from what I've said why this should be the case. The reason is that nobody wants to have gone through an unbelievably humiliating ritual to join a fraternity only to discover that what they joined was a waste of time. So the way that we deal with this problem psychologically is to make ourselves believe that we've joined something incredibly special. It's very difficult to avoid this. I am buying a car, I'm fully aware of this. I've read almost all the literature on this particular issue. I was choosing between a blue car that was too dull and a gold car that was too bling, and ultimately I chose the blue car, and I now can't imagine for a second how I could possibly have ever considered buying a ridiculous gold car. But I'm aware that this actually was just a feature of the university fraternity principle. I'd gone through the difficulty of choosing it, and having chosen it, I was convinced that I'd made the right decision, because I didn't want to have wasted all that time. But even though I'm aware of it, I can't escape it. This is people's consistent commitment to their decisions that they've made is a very big feature. Lawyers who have been involved in court cases where they have incorrectly prosecuted somebody and that person has been found guilty are more likely to feel strongly that the person was in fact guilty, the more obvious it becomes that they were not guilty. Because the more obvious it becomes they were not guilty, the more painful their original decision appears to them, and the harder they have to work in order to persuade themselves that they were actually on the right side all along. And you see politicians do that all the time. This is the reason why U-turns are so difficult. You ought to congratulate politicians on making U-turn. They're almost impossible, because everyone says how humiliating it is, when what they should really be doing is thanking heaven that somebody's moved from a stupid decision to a good one, and never minding that they've shown that inconsistency. The reason for raising the university fraternity test in a political context, of course, is that nobody went through a more humiliating university fraternity initiation ritual than the Liberal Democrats when they joined the coalition. It was incredibly hairy for them. They were joining with the Conservatives. They had to drop their policy on tuition fees. They were pilloried everywhere that they went. And the more humiliating it was, the more convinced they were that they'd done the right thing. As you would expect to happen. And the Conservatives, who weren't anywhere near as humiliated by the decision, have been the ones that have harboured the doubts, almost exactly because it's been less difficult for them, not because it's been more difficult for them. As the Liberal Democrats have gone through this, they are going to remain all the way through to the end to demonstrate that they made the correct decision. At the beginning, I've been saying from the beginning what I think is now more clear, that this coalition would last the distance. People kept saying to me at the beginning that David Cameron was going to call a general election, and I just said, I've just been in a flat in 10 Downing Street and he's just put in a kitchen. Isn't going to do that. So I didn't think that anybody was going to give up being Prime Minister lightly, but the more sort of compelling idea was the Liberal Democrats were going to abandon the coalition, and I didn't think that was likely because of the university fraternity ritual. Actually, I think the difficult thing for the coalition, and I was just expressing this to a couple of friends, is not going to be how to keep the marriage all the way through the election. It's how to organise themselves so they don't. I think they haven't really worked out that they're going to come to a general election still in harness with each other, and then have all the journalists be amazed at how much they disagree with each other, and have the election campaign dominated actually by disagreements between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives that they kept secret right up until the election campaign. And they have to, in fact, the strategy which everyone thought was necessary, how do you keep the marriage on the road, is exactly the opposite problem. The problem they've got is how do they begin to part company. Finally, the hotel towels. So you have all stayed in hotels, I'm sure, where there's been a little sign that says, if you want to help the environment, please hang your towel back on the rack. And all of us think to ourselves, this is just to help the hotel's laundry bill, not the environment, as we drop the hotel towel on the floor. Maybe you're a better citizen than me. But I've certainly been tempted to do that, let's put it that way. There has been some studies about how to increase compliance with this little sign. And they did it on a whole series of holiday inns in Arizona. And they discovered that if you put on the card 75% of people staying in this hotel hang their towel back on the rack, it increases the number who do it on any given night from 38% to 48%. But if you put on the card 75% of people staying in your room hang their towel back on the rack, this increases the proportion who do it from 38% to 58%. And the reason for this is that we're all unbelievably keen to discover how people like us behave. This is the reason why everybody who's here tonight is dressed broadly similarly. Nobody has come wearing Speedos. Somebody was telling me, in fact, just as I left to come to this meeting, Grayson Perry was coming through Peer's entrance of the House of Lords. And what makes Grayson Perry so compelling, because when you talk to him, he's just like any other bloke, only he's dressed like a woman. And it's unbelievably disconcerting, because nobody does that. We all look to see what other people who lived in the same room of the Holiday Inn are doing, even though we've never met them. We want to remain, because we're so keen to discover, what the truth is and how people behave. And this is an incredibly strong feature. So strong that if I said about somebody, he looks like a geography teacher, everybody in the room would have at least some idea of what I was talking about. The person looks like a geography teacher. But if you think about it for a second again, why on earth would someone look like a geography teacher? Well, the answer is twofold. First of all, if you become a geography teacher, you slowly but surely begin to look like all the other geography teachers so that you don't stick out in the staff room. But the second reason is that if you already look like a geography teacher, you're more likely to become one. Now, I realise that this struck you as unlikely, but a study of the American Dental Association suggested that people called dentists were more likely than at random to become dentists. And people who are called Louise are more likely to move to Louisiana, and people called Florence are more likely to move to Florida. These are small, replicable, statistically significant, small but statistically significant, and they're not data trawling. But they're fascinating because people are so keenly aware, even if subconsciously, what other people like them are doing. This is ignored all the time in politics, or indeed in street signs. So in the petrified forest in Arizona, they used to have a sign, please do not steal the petrified wood. Everyone's been stealing it, and if it goes on like this, there won't be any left. And people were looking at it and thinking, I better get mine now then, before they run out. I tried telling Jeremy Paxman had that campaign on rubbish, don't put rubbish on the street, and which started by saying that he keeps seeing people throw rubbish out of their windows of their cars. But the effect of that is to normalise throwing rubbish out of your window. If everybody does it, so will you. And indeed, there are studies that suggest that if your friends are fat, you are more likely to be fat. If your friends smoke, you are more likely to smoke. If your friends are happy, you're more likely to be happy. These are statistical studies because people copy the people they know and they follow the things that they read and try to be like the people who are like them and behave like that. That's one thing that's interesting about this, but the thing I want to leave you with is that it's interesting to try to think why that is the case. And the reason is that the root of human cooperation, the reason that we bother talking to people and helping people who don't share our genes is the reciprocation of favours. Basically, we've discovered a good survival strategy is that you do something, if I do something for you, you do something for me. Vampire bats will regurgitate blood to another vampire bat on the point of death, even when that vampire bat is not related to them, because they expect the favour to be reciprocated. But the critical thing is the favour must be reciprocated. It's not a good evolutionary strategy if you are deceived by the other vampire bat. So what we've got to do is develop strategies that allow us to identify who's likely to deceive us and who is not likely to deceive us. And one of the ways that we do that is by identifying with people who are like us. Sadly, we also then wage wars against all people who are not like us. So the thing that produces cohesion also produces wars, which is rather depressing. But we have the reason that the towel works is because people are looking to see who's like them so they can cooperate and with those people and be like them so that they can be in groups because that is a good evolutionary survival strategy. What this suggests is that one of the core things in politics is the idea that somebody else is taking out what you put in. It's one of the driving features of human experience and human behaviour. The idea that in this deal, I put in, I get out, the reciprocity. The other vampire bat is cheating. They're getting the blood and you are not. This is a strong suspicion. If you look at all the gut issues in politics, they all share this in common. Immigration. The idea is people are coming over here, not having contributed to the NHS, and they're not paying, they're using it despite having not contributed to it. And all the political arguments that you and I might muster suggest that that is a false way of looking at it, and however crazy the argument might drive us, it's still very strong. If you look at the other issues, what are they? Crime. The idea that somebody's stealing and living off you. Welfare fraud. The idea that somebody is being paid to sit on their backside while you have to go to work. However true it is, and by the way, one of the other unfortunate features is that people are trying to deceive you in this deal, so people are not wrong to think that it's quite possible that they'll be deceived, but however true it is, you feel it even more strongly that it's true. And these are the strong motivating issues in politics. Alongside then, the idea in politics that you look at how your life is improving and how your life is going to improve. The other big motivating theme in this is someone is getting away with the blood that really belongs to me. And you can see that happening all the time in politics. So to finish with, I think if I was giving you two pieces of advice to follow politics, that last one would be my way of trying to understand a lot of the political debate. And people often elevate that to an observation, even when it isn't, or to an association of their own personal interests with the public interest. It's one of the most constant things is people's incredible ingenuity at making their own self-interest look as though it's in everybody else's interests at the same time, and their suspicion that everyone's doing that to them. But I suppose that if I was really giving you a single piece of advice that allows you to watch Newsnight and understand what's going on, the most important thing would be to say, you are watching Newsnight and everyone else has gone to bed. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Daniel has agreed to take your questions, and there will be some roving mics, I believe. And so if you simply put up your hand, we'll get it moving.
It's usually the case that once one person has asked a question.
That's right. Well, since we seem to have some hesitation, I wonder if I can come to football and observe that Sunderland has beaten Manchester United now on 2 occasions in the last month. Do you think they can win the FA Cup?
Well, do I think, if to rephrase this question, do I think their chances of winning either the FA Cup or League Cup are 0%? No, obviously not. Clearly, question is what their percentage chance is. Yeah. That's one of the things that happens all the time when people look at football, is that they will make a statement, I think Manchester United will win on the weekend, or Manchester United will win on the weekend. And you think, well,
There's a percentage chance that they will and a percentage chance that they won't. And we don't know what the result is yet. If we did, there'd be no point playing. One of the things about football is incredibly random. Knockout tournaments are very random, but so is the Premier League. So the Premier League is 38 games. That is not long enough to be anywhere remotely confident the person who wins the Premier League is the best team. And very many years, it isn't the best team. And that was also the case last year when Manchester United won the league without being the best team. And what's happened this year is they're simply losing some of the games that randomness might have made them lose last year. There you go. That is the answer to your question.
Well, that was certainly a political answer. So there was a question over here.
It's unlikely they'll win the FA Cup because they're in the third round, and quite likely they'll win the League Cup because they're in the semi-final. How about that?
Yeah. Okay, good.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. So I'm Nigel Whitehead, and my question is a simple one. What are the dynamics of the Scottish independence vote from a political perspective?
Oh, okay. Number one, and top of all of it, comes loss aversion. Okay, so the advantage is strongly with the Union, as it was strongly against AV. It's very difficult for someone to promote risky change over the status quo because people fear what they're going to lose. Now, the interesting thing is when it comes to a European referendum, it becomes more complicated because those who favour staying inside the European Union can threaten people with the loss of leaving, very strong argument, but those people who want to leave can threaten people with the integrationist consequences of staying in, particularly on immigration, which is the reason why they've raised that issue partly, because it helps overcome the loss aversion problem. But on the Scottish referendum, I would be surprised right from the beginning if the Scots will vote for it, because it'll be very difficult for them to get over the hurdle of it being risky change. And basically the campaign, Better Together, is all about warning against risky change. And however much my paper, I had the embarrassment of somebody in the House of Lords reading out an editorial in my paper urging the Better Together campaign to be more positive, which I'd A, written, despite the fact that I was sitting just behind them as they made the speech, and B, didn't agree with.
Yes.
Thank you. Peter Varnish, Fellow of the Academy. Have you come across any engineers in your Lordship's house, and do they make good parliamentarians?
Well, I haven't been in the House of Lords very long, but the good thing about the House of Lords is that people can contribute on very specific policy issues, and they will be listened to because they're experts in those areas. And as it so happens, the issues that you talk about haven't really come up yet, so I haven't had a chance to see that happen. But but I'm anticipating that it will. So we've had there's been a debate on medical ethics. It was very fascinating. There were a lot of people who could contribute to that debate. But there are engineers and scientists in the House. I'm not familiar with everybody who's there, and we haven't been through a debate when that's been to the fore, but it will be.
Well, the Academy has provided the House with Lord Brewer, so a former president, a very distinguished engineer.
We're yet to meet, but look forward to it. Who wants to ask now?
Yes, lady here in the second row.
Good evening, Juliet Henderson. I was wondering if you had any ideas as to why the Conservatives in particular aren't engaging with female voters.
Okay, so the biggest problem the Conservative, following the My model, where lots of people vote based on their interests and experiences, and women voters are even more interested in, as it turns out, polls suggest, in their direct experience and that of their family, and even less interested than men in abstraction about and promises of politicians. And the reason why the Conservatives are struggling with women is because household income is struggling, and women feel aggrieved, but also, and this is a very powerful political notion, sort of psychological feeling, they also feel oddly guilty about not being able to provide their families with the things that they're doing. I'm, by the way, not inventing this. This is what focus groups are suggesting. And the problem with this is that although there's lots I think the Conservative Party has to do to be more socially aware and more diverse, and I've always made that argument, actually that's not the reason why it's not doing as well as it should among women. The reason is a much more difficult thing, which is to do with people's lives and how hard they are, and the fact that that is felt particularly by people trying to balance household budgets. And that situation will only improve if the economic policy works to improve people's budgets. And who knows whether it will. It looks like it will, but it's early.
Thanks very much. Very interesting talk. David Bogle, I'm at UCL, as it happens. I had a question that relates to your loss aversion point and your sort of statistics numbers point. You're saying that people really don't understand about numbers and statistics and so on. But when it comes to loss aversion, there's often cases where people might lose something, but the risk and the potential risk is absolutely very, very small. So there's a real problem, particularly with engineering projects. There's a lack of understanding of risk and uncertainty, and that seems to be reflected often in reports and in the press in particular. I wonder if you have any insights as to how we could improve the position, improve the understanding, improve people's ability to respond.
Yeah, I wish I could tell you that working in the newspaper and everything had made me kind of less frustrated than you probably all are in numeracy, but actually it's the opposite is the case. And I do sit in meetings and I remember a particular event when the number of women A-level students doing better, basically they had got better compared to men, but in GCSEs the situation was the opposite. And the person doing the news conference was commenting on how interesting this was. And I said, is it statistically significant? And the person's response was, well, it's very interesting. I said, well, it's not interesting to me if it's not statistically significant. And people didn't really know what I was talking about, and despite the fact that these people are graduates. You know, we also once printed the probability of something, which added up to 13 out of 10. And when I rang the sort of revised sub, and I said, they can't be 13 out of 10. He said, oh, I didn't realise it had to add up to 10 out of 10. I said, well, they're mutually exclusive events. Now, you know, I should say the Times is actually quite hot. We regard ourselves as very, you know, we try to bring people on board who are numerate, and it's still a problem. So the answer is, you know, we've got a national problem with trying to explain basic mathematical concepts to people. And one of the reasons I write my football column, actually, is to try to make people think in that way. It is quite alien. My friend, my brother-in-law went to a football match, and the person in front of him, it was England versus Latvia, I think, and the person in front of him, he was with me, and in the queue for some drinks, said, what do you think our chances are, mate? And he, before thinking about it, he responded 62.7%. I don't think that's what the person was expecting as an answer. So anyway, there's basically a lot of work to try to make people understand the concept of risk, and understand the concept of statistically significant, and understand the concept of randomness. And I do think the understanding of this is better than it was 10 years ago, but we've got a lot of work to do, and I constantly have discussions with people which reveal poor grasp of that.
Yes, gentleman just across there, yeah? Middle row.
Yes, Martin Devenish, thank you very much. Yep. Do you think Russell Brand has a point?
Not really, actually. I mean, do you know, well, okay. Let me put it this way. There is something very interesting about Russell Brand, who's expressing, for those who are not following, a kind of nihilistic, sort of anti-establishment, sort of revolutionary rhetoric, but not attached to any concrete plan to change anything, as far as I can see, but just as rhetoric. And what's interesting about it is that what dispersed information technology is doing is challenging the power and trust in elites in both good and bad ways. And Russell Brand is the sort of poster boy for that. And although it's not very coherent, actually, it's very common and very interesting. So do I think, the first thing I should say is I think he's quite interesting. And the second thing is, look, the guy's a Hollywood star. I'm not a Hollywood star, and he's a millionaire, and I'm not a millionaire. So I wouldn't want to be disrespectful of his achievements in this field. I don't, however, think his economic policy is all that attractive. And you know, I'm particularly critical of the fact that ultimately it's impossible to try and understand what it is he proposes that we should do. And I suppose that I find it a bit irritating to be attacked as kind of greedy by someone who's quite so personally wealthy and doesn't see any need to make some response to that himself.
Yeah. Yes, now we go to the right. Yeah.
President, thank you. Scott Steedman. I thought David's question about risk was very interesting, and I'd just like to take it one step further, because the engineering community can address the numerics of the risk model and so on, but they come up against a politician, perhaps in Europe, perhaps elsewhere, who says, aha, I have the trump card called the precautionary principle. And at that point, engineers go, oh, but that doesn't work. So what is the tactic to address politicians who try to pull out this very difficult card where they say, actually, you can't cross the road because you might get run down, so therefore we won't have roads, or we won't do it because that's the precautionary principle, and I'm invoking that, and it trumps your risk argument?
I mean, obviously, we have tried to have those arguments the whole time. You must start by remembering one thing, which is that politicians are not bad at what they do. I think they have too much. They have too much of an interest in the minutiae of politics. In other words, they're fooled by randomness too much. They perceive patterns where there aren't any, and they follow too small things, and they possibly underestimate, therefore, the importance of achievement over those things. So there are systematic errors in political profession, just like there are in banking or whatever, there are in politics. But politicians do understand electorates. They spend all their time. I know people always say politicians are out of touch, but when I was a parliamentary candidate, and you knock on everyone's door, you get a really much better feel than you do in the so-called real world, actually, in doing other things, when you're only meeting people like you. And most people are not like you. And it's an extraordinary experience you have meeting this unbelievable variety of people and realising what they do and don't know. Sometimes being overawed by their talent, actually, whilst at the same time bowled over by their lack of interest or knowledge of much public affairs. So politicians do understand their electorate, and what they're playing back to with the precautionary principle is loss aversion. And if you understand that, you realise basically that you always have to present your schemes with very high multiples of advantage over cost, because the economists are wrong, £1 of advantage is not worth 99p of cost. And if you understand that psychological gap, you just have to pitch at a much bigger rate of advantage, and often you can do so. But politicians are often quite good at gauging what the people who elect them think, and that's why they've been elected.
Yes, we had a question here, sir.
Tony Ridley, if I catch you later, I'd like to ask you, why do Sunland win all their cup games but none of their league games? But we'll come to that later.
Because you're fooled by randomness. Genuinely, there is no reason for that. In other words, one of the hypotheses is that teams play differently in cup matches, and there doesn't appear to be a tremendously consistent pattern. There is a bit of a squad selection pattern. In other words, that Manchester United in the Capital One Cup would select a less good team, slightly less good, and the difference that makes is small enough that actually we don't use it when we model for the result, but you might use it in a casual conversation. So that might make a very small difference. But on the whole, what your experience is that Manchester United are a team that are losing quite a lot of their games, and they happen to have lost 2 of them.
I hope the President will allow me to ask my real question now.
Of course, Tony, for you.
I have observed and have frequently argued that whereas the first half of my career was heavily based on my mathematical and scientific education and engineering practice, the latter half has been based very heavily on issues of interpersonal relationship, group dynamics that I learned from my therapist wife. What advice, based on what you've told us tonight, would you give to the Academy about how engineers might better argue in favour of the crucial nature to the future of Britain of the engineering fraternity?
Well, it's very interesting, and I take very seriously the idea that you've learned that from your wife who's a therapist. And the reason for that is, in the last 15 years, we've learned a huge amount more than we knew about how people think. In my view, some social psychology is flawed scientifically. It relies on too small a sample size sometimes, and some of the experiments are questionable from a pure scientist point of view. But the amount of wisdom and in that field is large, and I think economists have been very late in trying to plumb it. But what I would say is that the problem of how people behave is a problem amenable to scientific research and discovery and learning. The Royal Academy should take an interest in that, because it's a feature in all the things that you do. And probably, I know there are people at City University, for example, which I'm familiar with because my father was there, who were very interested in this, particularly this personal the personal behaviour and risk. And so it's very important to learn it. I mean, obviously, people's loss aversion and their attitude to risk is a feature of engineering problems and solutions. So the answer to your question is, it's a scientific thing which we can learn about, and we ought to do so.
Excellent. The very back.
John Roberts. Do you think it was a strategically smart move for David Cameron to set the election in advance in May 2015 and take away all his flexibility?
Well, the reason it was strategically smart is because the Liberal Democrats insisted on it, and he wouldn't have been. And that's a very important. That's a very important factor in this government. They had a relationship. Is there a problem there, or the glass? No, that's right. It's fine. Don't worry. It just fell over. I guess that the Prime Minister would not wish to be boxed in, because you would wish to be able to time the election at a time when you thought you had 9 good months and 3 good months to follow. And you'd want to put your election in that time. So therefore it is a considerable power, and you wouldn't wish to lose it. But for precisely that reason, the Liberal Democrats didn't want David Cameron to have it. However, it has actually had a positive advantage for David Cameron as well. I think it's made his government more stable, not just the Liberal Democrat membership of it, but his tenure as Prime Minister. There's a sort of settled acceptance by journalists that he's going to go the full 5 years, and people haven't spent a lot of time speculating on whether it will be shorter than that. He hasn't lost this entire period, which he would now lose, in which he can govern and make decisions, worrying about whether he should call a general election or not. And by the way, not actually being able to make that decision very easily. It's often a very difficult thing, because you're dealing with random variables. And it doesn't look to me like he'd have wanted to call the election. So he's been fortunate, because it looks to me like the time which will be the optimal to call the election for him is, in fact, May 2015. So he's been fortunate.
One more question? Yes. Yes? We'll bring you the mic. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Main. I'm from the Campaign for Science and Engineering, and one of our main objectives is to raise the profile of science and engineering in politics and with politicians. And I wonder if you could sum up how you would advise doing that.
Gosh. That's right. I mean, the first thing I'd advise is not to take the advice of anyone who's trying to answer off the top of their head. Well, I think actually at the moment the role that the relationship between science and growth has become clearer to politicians, and that has created a sort of new category of friends for science in politics, which you're not going to easily lose, and one of the strongest of those being the Chancellor. And I know there's a bit of a fight at the moment about the budget of science. My understanding from him is that he's not intending to back off the pro-science position in that row. And the reason for that is I think some interesting work, partly David Willett's inspired, partly that work that Jonathan Haskell did on the relationship between basic research and growth, has been very influential, made a proper intellectual case, and has been very influential. And so I suppose that my advice would be to try to win your point through some proper argument, and that's exactly what you are doing, and try to make that connection in that case, because everybody is looking for the secret on growth. I mean, just one last point. I was doing Newsnight the other evening, and we had a pretty fruitless, actually, discussion about public spending. And I was trying really hard, not to make a partisan point, but actually I was genuinely interested to try to get the two Labour people who were on the panel, one who was the shadow minister sitting over there and one who was sitting next to me, to explain to me at least very broadly what it was they intended to do on public spending. I wasn't trying to make a point genuine, I wanted to know. And as the sort of music started, the shadow Treasury spokesman just said the word growth. Right, it's going to grow our way out of the problem. Well, it's not a stupid answer, as long as you can find ways of increasing the United Kingdom's trend rate of growth, which is basically has eluded every politician. But if there is a way of doing that, the only possible way of doing it is scientific education, more mathematicians and scientists in school, more engineers, therefore we can create higher paid jobs, and attract more businesses to this country who want to use our skill base and therefore compete more. That is the only answer. So it seems to me as though, since everybody is going to give that potentially actually quite foolish answer to the problem of public expenditure, it provides you with a very good response and an opening for your campaign. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed, Daniel. You've been amusing and you've been entertaining, and you provided us with a lot of information and football tips. We've got all these new rules in life now, football rule and the pain rule and loss aversion and the contrast principle. So we engineers need to get to work and get those absorbed into our vocabulary. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will immediately want to join me in thanking Daniel once more for an extremely stimulating evening. Thank you.